Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the Festival Director. Over the coming months, we look forward to sharing with you the audio recordings from the 2022 festival. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. Our modern society is dependent on extraordinary levels of abuse and violence towards non-human animals. While we may love animals, we continue to interact with them in thoughtless, violent and cruel ways. We destroy their habitats, regulate their slaughter, farm and exploit them, and even in extreme circumstances, sexually abuse them. In her FODI 2022 talk, The Last Taboo, historian Joanna Bourke asks us how we can love and care for animals better. Please note this session contains themes that may be sensitive to some listeners, including depictions of animal abuse and bestiality.
Oh, look, I just want to say I'm really thrilled to be here to talk with you and to hear your views and to just kind of explore different aspects, in this case, of sexuality and, of course, human-animal interactions. Those of you who have followed the media storm, I've survived it. Here I am. It's been a journey, shall we say, and a journey of learning, as well as everything else. Of course, very distressed, of course, to discover that loving animals for some people means actually sexually abusing animals. The dangerous idea that I seek to discuss with you today is, of course, how we can love animals better, not fuck them. This is, I think, truly a dangerous idea. Because, of course, as we all know here, our society, modern society, is hugely dependent on extraordinarily high levels of abuse and violence towards non-human animals. Indeed, the main ways that humans interact with animals, including our companion species, is thoughtless, it is violent, and it is zoocidal. We claim to love animals, but we have a very poor track record in expressing those kinds of love. We admire exotic wildlife, but we destroy their habitats. We are obsessed and enraged by acts of cruelty against animals, and yet, of course, we regulate their slaughter in abattoirs. Western lifestyles are almost wholly dependent upon farming practices, which of course are often exceptionally cruel, indeed can involve forms of torture against animals. Now, given humanity's long history of exploiting animals, I actually don't think it's particularly surprising that we also, some of us, also sexually abuse them. Sexual assault, in other words, is just one of many ways that we harm animals. Yet we are repeatedly told that this is a taboo. Even historicizing, and I'm an historian, so that's sort of what I do, even historicizing these kinds of practices are seen as somehow beyond the pale. People who are neither vegetarian nor vegan might want to think about why discussing sexual violence against animals is particularly disgusting. We use their skin for handbags, we ingest their flesh, we slaughter them. Violence is intrinsic to human-animal reactions, yet the sexual part of sexual violence is something that is particularly revolting for most people, even to carnivorous leather fetishists. Many of us can't simply get over the uck factor. Now, in this talk, I'm going to do something really quite basic. I'm going to progress in these 5 steps. First, historicize what used to be called bestiality. Second, examine the role, very briefly, played by religion and law. Third, explore the medicalization of bestiality. Fourth, I want to look at the ways this medical term, zoophilia, has been appropriated by so-called self-designated zoos. And finally, look forward to a way where we can think of loving our non-human companion species. I'm going to start, though, by asking what bestiality, or sex with animals, meant for early 20th century Australians. And I'm going to just make a confession here. I picked a date literally out of my hat, 1903. I don't know why it wasn't 1900 or 1905, but 1903 I chose. Newspapers throughout the colony, crime correspondents were diligently reporting on the depraved appetites of their communities. Drunkenness and greed, pride and slothfulness, avarice and anger, vanity and lust. Australians certainly were wallowing in the 7 deadly sins. The worst of these was, of course, lewdness, their term, with animals. In Australian law, bestiality, 1903 I'm talking about, was defined as an act of feloniously, wickedly, and against the order of nature, having a venereal affair and carnally knowing an animal. Dog, bitch, mare, goat, these were the 4 most common animals listed in court indictments. Legal rulings condemned those who committed and perpetrated that detestable and abominable crime of buggery, not to be named among Christians. According to one journalist writing from a courtroom in Mossman in New South Wales, this was the most loathsome of all the charges that could be brought against an unfortunate man. That no moral man, no man in an ordinary state of mental health would be guilty of, or capital letters, so abominable an offense goes without saying. It was a most revolting offense, wrote another reporter, or, in the words of yet another, it was such an abominable offense that the evidence was not fit for publication. Australian commentators, again, 1903, viewed these sexual acts with animals as through the prism, if you like, of human exceptionality. Bestiality, in other words, breached this great chain of being that ranked humans, white male ones particularly, higher than non-human animals. It was, for them, a violation of property rights of course, the owners of the animals. It was demonic. This links to the idea that somehow demons would appear to human beings in the guise of animals. It was polluting. It polluted the human species. It was a sign of human depravity, often triggered by intoxication or insanity. Now, as the century progressed, however, we see huge changes in the way Australians were viewing this act. Bestiality was renamed and medicalized under the title zoophilia, although it retained its character as one of the most debased sexual crimes. 1973, for example, the editor of Canberra's Waroni assumed that their readers would understand what zoophilia meant. They used it all their time, assuming that they knew who Krafft Ebing was, for example, late 19th century classic called Psychopathia Sexualis, which is when the term zoophilia first appeared, was invented. 1994, the Canberra Times also was very confident that its readers would understand the term zoophilia when they casually dropped it in along with flagellation, hardcore porn, and masturbation in an article on scintillating sex. Now, of course, zoophilia means love of animals, even though, thanks to Krafft-Ebing and numerous other psychiatrists, particularly forensic psychiatrists, it has become synonymous with this sexual love of animals. Now, of course, for most people, sexual desire is not what we mean when we say that we love our animals. In fact, pet ownership goes back to early human societies. In Australia today, 3 in every 5 households live with a pet, and 90% of households have or house a pet at some stage in their life cycle. What this does is it makes Australia one of the countries with one of the highest proportion of pet owners in the entire world. Now, although pet owners are generally reluctant to allow their animals to act according to their nature, many of them euthanize them when they grow old or disobedient or unattractive. I think there is general agreement that love for pets means giving them food and water, taking them for walks, and talking to them. Half of all pets sleep in the same bed as a member of the human family. We maintain fictive kinship ties with them. There are many Australian websites advertising pet wedding services, I have discovered. Pets are us. We indulge them. We buy them presents. We give them names. We look at them as kind of almost human. We kiss, caress them. What we don't do is have sex with them. At least most of us don't. Sex with animals is one of the last taboos. The prohibition on bestiality distinguishes the human subject from the animal object. For researchers, a chief problem that we face when we're trying to look at the history of these practices is the almost total absence of reliable statistical information about just how many people engaged in sex with animals. Admitting to having sex with animals, not surprisingly, carries with it an incredible stigma. Even men convicted of sex offenses against humans are reluctant to admit to being sexually aroused by animals. Just to give you one example here, this is an example from 2014. 38%, so nearly 40%, 38% of juvenile male sex offenders confess to having sex with an animal. When these young men were asked the same question using lie detector tests, etc., the percentage soared to 81%. So in other words, it's one of the arguments of the Loving Animal book, and indeed this book here that I published a few years ago called What It Means to Be Human, which is about human-animal interactions, that the sexual abuse of animals and the sexual abuse of girls and women are interconnected. Now, as I just said, we don't know how many people sexually abuse animals, nor do we know much about the animals involved. If they are not injured, these animals don't generally come to the attention of vets or other caregivers. Animal victims are often subsequently killed, their deaths unmourned. These are formidable limitations, which has, and I think unfortunately, led to a situation where nearly everyone who works in the field, nearly everyone who works in the field quotes Alfred Kingsley's very famous series, in fact a series of books, but the most famous one is his survey, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Kingsley and his colleagues found that one one adult American male in 12 or 14, that is around 8%, claimed to have had a sexual encounter with an animal. Farming communities, this percentage soars to 17%, and in some areas, the statistic rose to as high as 65%. I mean, these are shockingly high numbers, but they pale when compared to the cultural fascination with sex between human and non-human animals. For a taboo, it is certainly one that is talked about a great deal. From the earliest human cultures onwards, cave paintings and other artistic forms have depicted this kind of activity. The most ancient evidence comes from 18,000 BC, a cave painting in Italy showing a man penetrating an animal. The popularity, cultural popularity of bestiality in the arts has not declined in more recent times. Indeed, arguably, it has actually increased. No time to go into examples here, but they range from classical art to productions of Edward Albee's The Goat Who Is Sylvia, which played to enthusiastic audiences all over Australia and won numerous awards here in Australia as well as abroad, including finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. To, of course, famous films such as King Kong and Woody Allen's Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex but were afraid to ask. Our infatuation with images and creative literatures depicting sex between humans and animals suggest, I think, the degree to which animal and human sexuality are interwoven in the human imagination and culture. But let's get to real life. In real life, as opposed to fictive or artistic lives, bestial acts are criminal acts, and for good reason. Sexual acts between humans and animals are abusive. They harm the animal, they occur without consent. There's also concerns for human well-being. Mistaking an animal's consent to sex can be extremely dangerous. Dogs have teeth, horses and cows powerful thighs. Many instances of bestiality only come to public knowledge because the human perpetrator, and let's just be honest here, the male perpetrator, is injured or killed. Entrenched religious prohibitions have not only governed attitudes towards human-animal intercourse, but also informed the law. Like other forms of non-reproductive sex, such as, in the period of history, homosexuality, human-animal intercourse has been universally condemned by religious leaders. Judeo-Christian texts denounce bestiality as a major sin. Leviticus 18, verses 22 to 24, states that humans defile themselves when they lie with any beast. Historically, in Australia, as much as in Britain and the rest of the West, bestiality was subsumed under legislation prohibiting buggery. This was the official legal term, or non-reproductive sex. No distinction in law was made between buggery, legal term, between two men, or between a man and an animal. However, one thing I find really, really interesting is that prior to the 16th century, the crime of buggery was not harshly punished. This changed only in 1533 with the passing of the Buggery Act, which outlawed the detestable and abominable vice of buggery committed with mankind or beast. So it's also homosexuality, consensual homosexuality. Bestial acts were so offensive that the penalty was death. This remained the case when the laws were reformed in 1828 under the Offences of the Person Act. The ultimate penalty death was only revoked in 1861, when imprisonment became the chief way of punishing offenders. Although the amount of time spent in prison could be just a month or so, or it could be, of course, life. Now, despite the criminalization of bestiality in the 16th century, relatively few cases were in fact prosecuted. From 1674 to 1834, only 11 cases appeared before the Old Bailey, which is London's central criminal court. Bestial acts were regarded as much as of a sin as male homosexuality, again prosecuted under the same act, and masturbation, and therefore were more harshly punished if committed by a married as opposed to an unmarried man. Importantly, in the period prior to the mid-19th century, animals who incited the passions of humans were not necessarily believed to be innocent. Animals were believed to respond to human advances, they were not seen as purely passive victims of human lusts or male lusts. This helps explain, I think, why there are strong taboos associated with animals who had been sexually active with humans. They couldn't be eaten. For example, you weren't supposed to drink their milk. Sometimes this was because the animals were thought to have become polluted by sexual activities with humans. Other times, actually, it was because they were thought to be humanized by such activities, and therefore eating their meat, drinking their milk, a form of cannibalism. The assumption that animals could actually be agents in sexual encounters was expressed in other ways as well. For example, they might even be hauled into court so that judges could see whether by his or her behavior the offensive act had taken place. In courtrooms, animals could be made to appear alongside the human for accused of bestiality. The book gives a number of examples, but just one example here. Mary Hicks, a married woman living in the working class area of Cripplegate, 1677, she was brought before the London Central Criminal Court, accused of having sex with her dog. Unfortunately for her, when the dog was set on the bar before the prisoner, he, the dog, proved the allegation by wagging his tail and making motions, as it were, to kiss her, which 'twas sworn she did do when she made that horrid use of him. In this rather sad case, both parties were found guilty, and Hicks was actually made to watch her dog being hanged before she was as well. Such views, in other words, are a world away from current understandings in which animals are stripped of all agency and regarded as victims rather than co-conspirators. So that was the first major shift. The second major shift in legal understandings of human sexual activities occurred after the Second World War, when the seriousness of the offense was progressively reduced. In Britain, US, Australia, much of Europe, bestiality was increasingly removed from the list of felonies, appearing instead under legislation dealing with cruelty to animals, breach of the peace, trespass, damage to property, offenses against public decency. Remember, bestiality used to be prosecuted or used to be criminalized under buggery or sodomy legislation. The decriminalization of consensual male homosexuality, therefore, had a major impact on legal attitudes to bestiality. In other words, it decriminalized bestiality. So when they decriminalized homosexuality, those same acts decriminalized bestiality. So as a result, legislative bodies had to recriminalize bestiality, and they came across a major problem. How could bestial acts be distinguished from routine procedures in animal husbandry, and courts around the world debated this question. Dairy farmers use rape rack to forcibly restrain a cow while she's impregnated by a bull or artificially. Humans engage in foreplay to arouse animals prior to insemination. Animals are spayed, neutered, castrated, have their genitals restricted, are kept constantly pregnant. Standard farming practices, the castration of pigs, manual or electrical stimulation of genitals of bulls to collect semen are standard. In seeking to recriminalize acts involving the genitals of animals, legislators had to protect vets and other people engaged in routine animal husbandry. Anti-bestial legislation had to differentiate such penetrative practices in commercial farming from penetrative practices involving male sexual desire. The problem was not so much about the small number of people who engaged in sexual intercourse with farm animals, but how certain intimate acts involving the genital sexual organs of animals stood in relation to capitalist systems of production and reproduction. The bestialist manipulated the sex organs of animals in the interest of personal gratification. Farmers manipulated animal sex organs in the interest of capitalist production. The first act criminal, second act necessary for economic growth. A typical example of ways to get around this problem was the law in Washington state, after a huge debate which went on for a very long time about it, where the law decreed finally that a person would be guilty of animal cruelty if he or she knowingly engages in any sexual conduct or sexual contact with an animal, but only if it was for the purposes of sexual gratification. Now, while legal experts debated bestiality as an act, and one that proved rather difficult to define, psychiatrists began identifying it as an identity. From the late 19th century, bestiality was medicalized. With the growing institutional and ideological power of psychiatry, particularly its forensic branch, people who had sex with non-human animals were being diagnosed with psychiatric disorders. I've already mentioned the main person driving this, Krafft Ebing, in his Psychopathia Sexualis, first published 1886, who turned bestiality for the first time into zoophilia. Through a series of case studies, Krafft Ebing portrayed people who engaged in sexual acts with animals as profoundly unpleasant human beings. According to him, they possessed a heavy taint. They were suffering from constitutional neurosis, which made them impotent for the normal act. They were atavistic throwbacks to earlier evolutionary stages of life. In other words, bestialists were degenerates. They were vicious, incorrigible. A typical bestialist, this is according to Krafft Ebing, of course, was a man whose unmarried mother, mothers are always to blame in these discourses, whose unmarried mother was deeply tainted and hysterion epileptic. The patient's deformed asymmetrical cranium and deformity and asymmetry of the bones of the face were proof, he said, of psychic degeneracy. And, of course, he had been a masturbator since his early youth. In short, bestialist is a human monster. Now, Krafft Ebing's work proved really, really popular, with numerous psychiatrists conducting similar research that purported to show that people who had sex with animals were mentally ill and probably dangerous, not only to the animals, but also to girls and women. The problem with much of this clinical research is that it was conducted on populations that were highly marginalized in the first place. In other words, nearly all of, in fact, I think say all of these early surveys, were based on analyses of men who were in prison for highly violent offenses. Given such samples, it's inevitable that forensic specialists would conclude that bestiality was a symptom of vicious criminal tendencies, psychosis, and other serious mental disorders. Crucially, from the 1990s, men who experienced sexual desires for non-human animals began uniting together, identifying their desires as a sexual identity rather than a pathology. So what they did is they shortened zoophilia or zoophilics to simply zoos. An important section of them were annoyed that non-zoos routinely exploited, even killed animals, and were unconcerned by the fact that those animals did not give consent, yet at the same time that they demanded that in sexual relations they needed spoken consent. Researchers from the same disciplines that had been responsible for the pathologization of bestialists, so in other words, psychiatrists, sexologists, sociologists, began meeting with self-identified zoos and began communicating with zoo communities. They made a distinction, a really, really important distinction, between, for want of a better term, identity zoos and men who consumed zoo pornography, which is exceptionally violent and almost 100% involves the sexual exploitation and indeed torture of women as well as animals, human women as well as animals. However, the zoos who attracted the attention of these sexologists, psychologists, sociologists, were also not representative of the people who have sex with animals. Their samples, in other words, are just as skewed as their predecessors, ones which focused on prison populations. Members of zoo communities are likely to be older, more highly educated, had a strong sense of community than other people who have sex with animals. They are, in fact, more likely to value animals and therefore more concerned about evidence and arguments about consent. This is, of course, strong contrast to bestialists and some zoos who treat their partners as of no intrinsic value or worth. So, where are we now? What alternative ways do we have about thinking about love? And this is what I want to turn to now. In addressing these questions, I think we need to think about what we mean by sexual love. Humans engage in a range of activities that we call sexual, including caressing, kissing, masturbating, cunningling, filleting, penetrating. Both in legal texts and animal protection discourses, the assumption is often made that sex with animals involves penetration of the mouth, anus, vagina of one or more of the participants, and this is exactly how the Australian law defines it. This makes it extremely easy to argue that these acts are offensive and wrong. Ethical issues become less clear-cut if sexual includes non-penetrative eroticism or non-genital sensuality, such as stroking a dog's back or kissing a cat's lips. As mentioned at the start of this talk, debates about loving animals too often assume a phallic mode of sexuality that de-eroticizes the entire body or most of the body, locating sexual pleasure in the human or animal genitals. Those forms of trans-species sexuality are wrong and harmful. But what about love between different species? Is it even possible? How can we know? First thing to note is that non-human animals, like their human counterparts, are sensual beings. They experience pleasure. Any pet owner knows that their companion species enjoys being caressed and rubbed. It is one thing to observe that animals enjoy their own and other people's bodies, quite another to ask how people can correctly identify and interpret such feelings. Put another way, how can we ever know how another creature, human or non-human, feels? By very nature, mental acts are subjective, wishes and desires and preferences, internal and invisible. Is the other always an enigma? Moral philosopher Adam Smith thought long and hard about these issues. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, he argues that through acts of imagination, we place ourselves in his situation, we conceive ourselves enduring the same torments, we enter, as it were, into his body and become, in some measure, the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something which, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. In this way, he wrote, other people's agonies are made manifest, and then we tremble and shudder at the thought of what he feels. Now, cynics, and I'm always on the side of the cynics here, may simply retort that, people usually fail to make that empathetic leap into the feelings of others. And most of us will also agree that the imagination is especially unreliable when the other does not resemble us. But I think that should not stop us from trying to devise an ethics based on cross-species conviviality, especially when we are talking about species such as Canis familiaris, with whom we have closely evolved since between 9,000 and 30,000 years BCE. One of the chief stumbling blocks in human-animal understandings is the inability of non-human animals to talk any of the hundreds of animal languages, and the inability, of course, of humans to speak any of the millions of animal languages. Most animals speak to other members of their species, but not to us. But I don't think, however, that we should conclude that there is therefore little point in speculating about the mental states of other creatures. We can use our senses of sight, smell, sound, taste, touch to understand important aspects of other lives. People do this all the time. In fact, a very large proportion of human interactions are non-verbal, and faced with contradictory messages, most people actually trust the non-verbal over the verbal. This is equally true in erotic encounters. A verbal yes or no is not the only or usual ways to signal consent or non-consent. People routinely guess the wishes of other people through gestures and other signs. Now, of course, don't need to say this, do I? Misunderstandings are also routine. Miscommunications are also routine. Every single woman I have met in my life, did not need me to know that men regularly misread their wishes. I think there's actually a better way to put this, and that is they actually do register the meaning behind certain bodily gestures but choose to ignore it. And this is what humans do routinely with non-human animals. Furthermore, animals are not the only sentient beings who cannot signal emotion, desire, preference through language. A large proportion of us regularly have dealings with vulnerable humans who also cannot talk, that is, young infants. Although child abuse is a huge and pervasive problem, most parents don't find it particularly difficult to treat their infants according to their capabilities, or capacities, I should say. Parents may not know for certain what their infant wants, but they're pretty good at inferring her desire from language, body language, and vocalizations. A huge scientific literature exists that explores parent-child psychology. It shows that it's possible to infer the wishes of preverbal infants by paying close attention to observable actions and behaviors. Particularly after living together for long periods, humans and their companion species can make informed guesses about the wishes, desires, and preferences of others. And this process of interspecies exchange or understanding is helped by a large and growing literature illuminating the meanings behind species-specific behaviors. Now, of course, The key to interspecies communication is attentiveness. Environmentalist Tracy Walkington has particularly interesting things, I think, to say about paying attention. But you don't need to be an animal psychologist or philosopher to understand this. Pet owners routinely discern the preferences, emotional responses, and subjectivity of their companion species. People who live with pets are fairly accurate in perceiving, sometimes intuitively, ghost gestures or micro movements, and these are relational and culturally shaped. Of course, it is important not to overstate the case for human-animal communication. There are insurmountable differences in the way humans and animals explore the dyadic relationships. In attempting to divine the other's wishes, humans prioritize the visual. Dogs, for example, about smell. It's also not to deny status differentials. Power is never erased in human-animal relationships, or indeed in any relationship. And just because an animal might have agency does not mean they can't be and won't be exploited. Unlike the abundance of research exploring whole-body kinesthetic expressions between adults and infant humans, there is far less interpretive research done on how animals communicate. Indeed, I could make this point much stronger. Humans are positively resistant to treating non-human animals as communicative subjects. There's too much cultural, political, economic capital at stake. This does, however, require a different conception of sexuality, particularly one that is neither anthropocentric nor phallogocentric. A phallogocentric mode of sexuality, with its emphasis on penetration, force, and nature, harms animals. An anthropocentric one always confuses them. We need, I think, to take very seriously the argument that animals are not simply objects in nature, but historical actors in their own right. They are neither symptoms, symbols, nor metaphors. The complexity of their life is awe-inspiring, as are their sensual needs, desires, and preferences. We should not ignore the fact that happiness is morally relevant. We can all, I think, imagine ways of being companionate with an animal, a form of trans-species connectedness. Both human and non-human animals experience the world through encounters, collaborations, conflicts, bonds of affection. As I discuss in my book, but also in my talk today, the main ways that humans interact with animals, including companion species, is thoughtless, is violent, is cruel, is zoocentric. But it doesn't have to be that way. In the words of philosophers Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlichter in Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights, great book, by the way, the first thing humans must do is to recognize that animals are trying to communicate, then to be attentive to individual repertoires, such as vocalizations and gestures, before responding appropriately. It is a dialogic, co-created exchange, since the animals in our lives must know that attempts to communicate with them are not wasted effort. As a result, interspecies relationships can be complex, can be rich, can be fulfilling. Love, the most intimate and vulnerable emotion, by being open to otherness, I really do think, and I really do hope, that we can find ourselves finally edging towards becoming true companion species. Thanks very much.
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit the Ethics Centre website to find out more. Thank you.